Science PMH and P Module 2, Video 12. My name is Tina Joel. This video is from the Non-Pharm and Therapies series. In this video, we explore how family members function as parts of an emotional ecosystem. Every emotion, belief, and behavior within a family system is interconnected, influencing and reshaping each other over time. Through this lens, we'll study how pioneers like Murray Bowen and Salvador Minuchin transformed therapy by focusing not on individuals alone, but on the dynamic systems that shape them. Here are the learning objectives for this video. By the end of this video, you will be able to explain the foundational principles of family systems theory, including the idea that symptoms arise within relationship patterns, not isolated individuals. You will also be able to describe the key components of Bowen's family systems model, including differentiation of self, triangles, multi-generational transmission, and emotional cutoff. You'll also identify the primary techniques of Minuchin's structural family therapy, such as joining, boundary setting, enactment, and restructuring. You'll be also able to recognize how both models address family hierarchy, communication, and adaptation across generations. And finally, you'll be able to apply these concepts to clinical cases where improving family structure, emotional boundaries, and intergenerational understanding can enhance treatment outcomes. By integrating both Bowen and Minuchin's models, you'll gain tools to help families transform chaos into clarity, shifting from dysfunction to dynamic equilibrium. Let's first start with Bowen's family systems theory. Murray Bowen's family systems theory views the family as an emotional unit where each person's behavior is deeply interconnected with others across generations. Bowen proposed that understanding patterns such as differentiation of self, triangulation, and emotional cutoff helps explain how families manage stress and maintain balance. This model emphasizes that unresolved emotional processes are often passed down through generations, influencing how individuals relate, cope, and form their sense of identity. By exploring these intergenerational patterns, therapy focuses on increasing self-awareness and emotional regulation within the family system. Allow me to make the components of the Bowen's family systems model a little easier to remember. For those of you who have been watching the videos or reading my notes, know that I really don't like giving you extra things to remember. What I dislike is trying to you a completely unrelated sentence just trying to remember words or jog your memory. This just tries to stretch your memory. I try to use the words or components to form a story or sentence or create something meaningful that will stick in your brain. If you already have your own way of remembering components of these family therapies, please ignore the slides with mnemonics and proceed to the content slides, where you will find more details on each of the components of the therapies. Let's get started. For family systems, model, or therapy, allow me to connect you to a story. In this image, you see that there is a girl named Mu-Ri sitting at a bar with her friend. They are both talking about Mu-Ri's boyfriend, Bowen, who is at the same bar shamelessly flirting with another girl. Mu-Ri seems to be smitten with Bowen and continues to tolerate everything instead of getting out of the relationship, even though her friend is trying to convince that Bowen is no good for her. Instead, Mu-Ri starts telling her friend and starts defending Bowen and give reasons why she is still in a relationship with him. She tells her friend that Bowen is fast, he is different C, he is fancy, he can multitask, he is enough for me, I'm happy with him, I'm tired of the emotional posers out there who are totally emotionally cut off. So once again, what does she say? Bowen is fast, he is different C, he is fancy, he can multitask, He is enough for me. I'm happy with him. I'm tired of the emotional posers out there who are totally emotionally cut off. If you write it down at the same time you hear this will be so much easier to memorize and grasp. So how does this translate into our components for family systems therapy? Well, Murie and Bowen reminds you of Murray Bowen. When Murie is saying that Bowen is fast, that allows you to associate this with FAST, which is your family system theory or therapy. When Murie says that Bowen is different, see that you abbreviated by DIFC, that reminds you of features of this therapy, which is differentiation of self. When Murie says that he is FAMPC, that reminds you of family projection process, that for the first word. C is the second word, and that reminds you of sibling position. When Murie says that Bowen can multitask, multi reminds you of multi-generational transmission process. When Murie says that Bowen is enough, you see the NUF in the word and associate that with nuclear family emotional process. When Murie says tired, that reminds you of triangles. When Murie says emotional posers, that reminds you of the emotional process, and emotional cutoff is just emotional cutoff. Bowen's family systems theory begins with one simple but revolutionary idea, that a family operates as an emotional unit where every person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors influence everyone else. Bowen believed that anxiety and dysfunction are not isolated within individuals. They are transmitted through relationships over time, sometimes across generations. His theory emphasizes the need for differentiation of self, the ability to stay connected to others while maintaining one's individuality. In moments of family stress, this differentiation allows members to think clearly without being swept up in emotional reactivity. There are 8 concepts: how we balance independence with belonging, and how healing one relationship can ripple through generations. Murray Bowen's family systems theory presents 8 interconnected concepts that explain how emotional energy flows within and across generations. These concepts show us how families maintain balance and how that balance sometimes becomes rigid or dysfunctional. These components include differentiation of self, family projection process, sibling position, multi-generational transmission process, nuclear family emotional process, triangles, emotional process, and emotional cutoff. Now, let's discuss these concepts one at a time. This image signifies the meaning of the differentiation of self, where a robust tree has deep intertwined tree's roots, representing emotional connection, but is standing tall by itself without fusion. Differentiation of self is the central concept in Bowen's family systems theory. It refers to one's ability to balance autonomy and emotional connection within relationships. People with high differentiation can stay calm and think rationally, even when family emotions are intense. Those with low differentiation absorb others' anxiety and lose clarity, responding impulsively or over-adapting. Here's an example. A son feels torn whenever his parents argue. Rather than managing his own anxiety, he takes sides to keep peace. His self is fused with their emotional tension. He reacts instead of reflecting. The more differentiated response would be acknowledging both parents' feelings without losing his own perspective. Some of the Bowenian therapist strategies include the following. Coach self-observation. The therapist encourages the client to watch family interactions calmly, like a scientist studying a system. Another strategy is to encourage I position statements. Clients practice expressing thoughts clearly. I think, I feel, without emotional reactivity or blame. One more strategy is to teach emotional neutrality. Help clients recognize anxiety transmission in relationships and respond with thoughtful calmness. And lastly, helping the patient work toward internal balance, promote mindfulness of one's own reactions in family tension, learning to pause before reacting. The goal of Bowenian therapy is not detachment, it's connection with clarity. When a person can remain close to loved ones without losing self-definition, they achieve differentiation, the foundation of emotional maturity. In Bowen's family systems theory, a triangle is the smallest stable relationship unit. When tension rises between two people, a third person is unconsciously drawn in to relieve anxiety. While this stabilizes the relationship in the short term, it can perpetuate long-term dysfunction, diverting anxiety instead of resolving it. Triangles are not inherently bad. They are adaptive emotional responses, but when chronic, they lock families into rigid patterns. Understanding triangles helps therapists see how problems move through relationships rather than being confined to one person. Here is an example. In a family, parents argue frequently. To reduce the conflict, the mother turns to her teenage daughter for emotional support. The daughter becomes the third point in the triangle, absorbing anxiety that doesn't belong to her role. She may become anxious or symptomatic. For example, perfectionism, stomach aches, expressing stress that originally existed between her parents. Bowenian therapist strategies include the following: identify the triangle, help the family map who is drawn in during conflict and how anxiety is distributed. Another strategy is coach detriangulation. Encourage each person to manage direct communication rather than involving a third party. Third strategy is strengthen differentiation. Teach the third member, like the child, to remain empathic but emotionally neutral, caring without absorbing, and finally observe the process, not content. Bowenian therapists avoid taking sides. They help members see patterns of connection and reactivity. By bringing triangles into awareness, the therapist restores responsibility to the original dyad. In doing so, tension becomes a signal for growth rather than a cycle of blame or avoidance. The nuclear family emotional system describes the emotional patterns that develop within the immediate family unit, usually parents and children. According to Bowen, these patterns emerge in response to chronic anxiety and define how the family adapts or fails to adapt under stress. Common emotional patterns include marital conflict. Partners project tension onto each other instead of self-regulating. Another pattern includes dysfunction in one spouse. One partner overfunctions while the other becomes dependent or symptomatic. There can be impairment in one or more children. Anxiety funnels into the identified patient, often a child who displays behavioral or emotional symptoms. Another pattern is that of emotional distance. Family members withdraw to avoid anxiety but lose intimacy in the process. Here is an example. A mother feels anxious about her husband's emotional distance and unconsciously invests all her energy in their son. As her focus intensifies, the boy becomes increasingly anxious and begins having panic attacks, carrying the family's unresolved tension. Bowenian therapist strategies include the following: map the emotional process. Use calm observation to identify how anxiety moves through the system, who overfunctions, who distances, who absorbs. Coach self-responsibility. Encourage parents to manage their own tension rather than projecting it onto children. Reduce reactivity. Teach family members to pause and respond thoughtfully to stress rather than reacting automatically. Strengthen dyadic functioning. Guide couples to communicate directly, reducing the tendency to displace anxiety through the children. Bowenian therapy treats the system, not the symptom. When one member learns to self-regulate, the emotional tone of the entire family begins to shift toward balance and calm. The family projection process is Bowen's explanation of how parents unconsciously pass their emotional reactivity fears, or unresolved anxiety or conflict to one or more of their children. Rather than confronting their own anxiety, parents externalize it, using the child to stabilize the system. Over time, the child absorbs this emotional load and may develop behavioral symptoms, anxiety, or over-responsibility. Here is an example. A mother who struggles with self-worth becomes overly focused on her son's academic success. She unconsciously projects her fear of inadequacy onto him, monitoring every grade and reacting intensely to small setbacks. The son internalizes her anxiety, becoming perfectionistic and fearful of failure. Therapist strategies include the following: promote parental self-reflection. The therapist helps parents recognize how their own anxiety influences their child's behavior. Another strategy is to encourage emotional separation. Support parents in managing their distress without expecting emotional regulation from the child. And lastly, the therapist can shift focus from symptom to system. The therapist redirects concern from the problem child to the overall family process, reducing projection pressure. When parents reclaim their own emotional responsibility, the child is freed to develop a healthier, more authentic sense of self. In Bowenian therapy, healing often begins when one generation stops carrying the unfinished business of another. The multi-generational transmission process describes how emotional functioning, relationship patterns, and levels of differentiation are passed from one generation to the next. In Bowen's view, families unconsciously hand down emotional roles, anxiety management styles, and even symptom patterns over decades. Here is an example. A grandmother who coped with conflict through silence raises a daughter who avoids confrontation, who then raises a son who withdraws when stressed. Each generation repeats the pattern, even without awareness of its origin. Therapist strategies include the following: use a genogram for mapping patterns only, not restructuring. The therapist helps the family trace emotional legacies and identify recurring roles or themes. Another strategy is to increase awareness of transmission, encourage reflection on how family rules or coping styles originated and evolved. Lastly, the therapist can coach differentiation through insight. As clients recognize inherited emotional habits, they can consciously choose new responses, interrupting the generational cycle. Bowenian work helps families realize that understanding their past doesn't bind them to it. It empowers them to change its course. Sibling position is Bowen's concept that birth order influences how individuals function in relationships. Bowen believed that sibling roles interact with emotional processes. Firstborns often carry responsibility, middle children mediate, and youngest may seek attention or independence. These patterns repeat in adult relationships, influencing leadership, caretaking, and conflict dynamics. Here is an example. In therapy, an eldest daughter feels overburdened caring for her younger siblings and continues this caretaking role in adult friendships and marriage. Her birth order position interacts with low differentiation, reinforcing her identity as the responsible one. Therapist strategy includes the following: help the client reflect on how family expectations linked to birth order shape present behaviors. Another strategy is to encourage awareness without blame, recognizing patterns as inherited roles, not permanent identities. Therapists may discuss how shifting expectations within the family system can free each member to function more authentically. Emotional cutoff occurs when individuals manage unresolved family tension by withdrawing, avoiding contact, or cutting off emotional communication with relatives. Bowen emphasized that emotional cutoff offers short-term relief, but leaves anxiety unresolved. Distance doesn't dissolve emotional ties, it simply hides them. Here is an example. A young man moves across the country to escape conflict with his father. Though physically distant, he continues to react emotionally to his father's disapproval, replaying arguments in his mind. His geographic distance is a mirror of emotional fusion, not freedom. Therapist strategy include the following. Guide the client to reestablish calm, limited contact rather than avoidance, focusing on thoughtful communication instead of emotional reactivity. Coach self-regulation before engagement, emphasizing curiosity and observation over confrontation. The aim is connection with clarity, learning to stay present in the relationship without losing emotional balance. The emotional process extends Bowen's systems theory to the wider world. He proposed that the same emotional forces shaping families also influence societies, organizations, and cultures. When social anxiety increases through economic instability, conflict, or cultural change, families absorb and reflect that tension. Societies with chronic anxiety show the same patterns as stressed families: polarization, reactivity, over-control, or emotional cutoff. Likewise, social support and adaptability promote collective differentiation and calm. Here is an example. During periods of economic stress, families may become more rigid, pressuring children to succeed or limiting emotional expression as a way to manage uncertainty. Therapist strategy includes the following. Help families contextualize their struggles within broader social stressors, reducing shame and blame. Encourage systemic thinking. How might what's happening around us be influencing what's happening between us? By zooming out, clients can see that personal conflict often reflects larger emotional currents in their community or culture. Bowen's final insight reminds us that no family exists in isolation. Each is a living part of a greater emotional ecosystem. As we move from Bowen's emotional systems to Minuchin's structural model, we shift from how anxiety moves to how families are organized. While Bowen taught us that families are emotional systems transmitting energy across generations, Salvador Minuchin viewed families as structured units governed by organization, hierarchy, and boundaries. His work focused on reshaping how members interact, realigning roles and relationships to restore balance. He proposed that there are interventions that help families move from chaos to structure, reconnecting members in healthy, functional patterns. What helped me remember the components is this mnemonic, and you can use it if you find it useful. So when I thought about Minuchin's structural family therapy, I visualized the word Minuchin as mini children, and these were bad kids who desperately needed structure, so their families hired General Joan Reary to set the children straight so they can be productive adults one day. In this case, I spelled hired in a different way to remind me that in family structural therapy, there are hierarchies. Then general, the first three letters stood for genograms. Jo stands for joining, in stands for enactment, the first re stands for restructuring, and the last re stands for reframing. In structural family therapy, pioneered by Salvador Minuchin, the therapist doesn't stand outside the family system, they step into it. This model is grounded in systems theory, which teaches that individual symptoms are not isolated problems, but expressions of dysfunction in the family structure and hierarchy. Minuchin developed this approach working with troubled adolescents, families where roles had blurred, parents had lost authority, or children had become mini adults. He believed that to change behavior, therapists must first change the structure, redefining how family members interact, where power sits, and how boundaries are drawn. The mnemonic, "They hired Jen, Joe, and Riri," captures the flow of a structural family therapy process, and like mentioned that it includes the following: hierarchy, establishing parental leadership, genogram, mapping the system, joining, entering the family's emotional world, enactment, observing interaction in real time, restructuring, reshaping boundaries, and reframing, transforming the family's narrative. Each step builds upon the last, helping families move from rigidity or chaos toward flexibility, clarity, and connection. Minuchin's guiding principle was simple yet profound. The symptom lives not in the child, but in the space between people. Structural family therapy begins with two essential tools, hierarchy and genogram mapping, because you can't change what you can't see. Hierarchy defines how authority and care are distributed in a family. Genogram mapping shows where those patterns live. Together, they form the blueprint of family functioning, the visible and invisible architecture of relationships. When Minuchin worked with families of troubled adolescents, he noticed that symptoms like defiance or withdrawal often pointed not to the individual, but to distorted hierarchies and unclear boundaries. The therapist begins by drawing the genogram, a visual family map of generations, alliances, and conflicts, then overlays questions of leadership. Who makes the rules? Who comforts whom when there's stress? Who gets left out of decision-making? These questions reveal how power and emotional responsibility flow through the system. For example, a genogram might show that a teenage daughter consistently mediates between divorced parents, symbolizing a role inversion where the child becomes the emotional caretaker. Through this mapping, the therapist helps the family see the system that sustains the problem. Once everyone can visualize the imbalance, it becomes easier to rebuild hierarchy intentionally, returning parents to leadership and freeing children from adult burdens. The therapist then reframes these insights compassionately. It looks like your daughter took on a lot of grown-up responsibilities to keep everyone calm. Let's explore how you, as parents, can carry that weight again. This is not about assigning blame. It's about redistributing function. The family learns that restoring hierarchy is an act of love, not control. Therapist strategies include the following: use genograms to visualize hierarchy and boundary lines. Identify cross-generational coalitions and role reversals. Empower parents to step back into leadership while honoring children's adaptive roles. Here is a core integrative insight. Mapping the family's hierarchy turns invisible patterns into shared understanding, the first step toward healthy, flexible structure. Before any restructuring can occur, the therapist must first earn the family's trust. This is done through joining, the process of empathically entering the family's emotional and relational world. Joining is the foundation of Minuchin's therapeutic process, the bridge between observation and influence. A therapist cannot change a family system they haven't first entered. In joining, the therapist mirrors the family's communication style, emotional tone, and rhythm. If a family speaks quickly and interrupts often, the therapist matches their tempo, signaling understanding rather than judgment. If a family is guarded, the therapist begins quietly, honoring their pace. Minuchin described joining as adapting to the family's culture without losing the self. It's both attunement and leadership, blending empathy with gentle authority. For example, a family enters session with tension, parents bickering, child silent. Instead of stopping the conflict immediately, the therapist joins by saying, "I can feel how much you both care. It's like you're fighting for the same goal in different languages." This statement validates the energy in the room while reframing conflict as connection. Joining techniques include the following: tracking, which relates to observing and commenting on interactions without judgment; mimesis, which means subtly matching body language or tone to build resonance; and lastly, accommodation, which relates to respecting family norms before introducing change. Once the family experiences the therapist as part of the system, resistance softens. They begin to trust that this outsider sees them not as broken, but as a family capable of balance. Here is a core insight. Change in structural family therapy begins not with challenge, but with connection. The therapist joins first, so the family can follow. After joining the family system, the therapist moves from empathy to action. The next step in structural family therapy is enactment, also known as role-playing real interactions in session. Enactment is one of Minuchin's most powerful techniques. It transforms theory into lived experience. Rather than discussing problems abstractly, the therapist invites the family to demonstrate a recent conflict or pattern right in the session. In this way, the family's interaction becomes the textbook. For example, if a mother says, "My son never listens," the therapist might respond, "Let's try it right now. Mom, ask him to do something you'd normally ask at home. Let's see what happens." As they interact, the therapist observes communication patterns, alliances, and boundary violations. Who interrupts, who withdraws, who rescues. It's live data. When tension arises, the therapist doesn't stop it. They shape it. They might say, "Dad, hold that thought. Notice how quickly you step in to defend him. What happens if you wait 5 seconds before speaking?" This subtle redirection allows the family to practice new responses in real time. Through enactment, patterns that were once invisible become tangible and therefore changeable. Clients begin to see their behavior reflected in the session, often for the first time. Over multiple enactments, the therapist helps the family experiment with alternative interactions, teaching flexibility, empathy, and clearer boundaries. It's not role play for performance, it's rehearsal for real life. Therapist strategies include the following: invite reenactments of conflicts or decision-making moments, observe and comment on process, not just content, highlight micro behaviors that reveal the structure of relationships, reinforce successful new interactions immediately. Here is a core insight. Families reorganize not through insight alone, but through experiencing new ways of relating, live, visible, and emotionally engaged. Once the therapist has joined the family and observed its patterns through enactment, it's time to intervene structurally. This next phase, restructuring and boundary making, is where the true transformation of the system begins. Restructuring is the process of changing the family's interactional patterns so that relationships become more functional and balanced. In Minuchin's model, this happens by adjusting the boundaries, the invisible lines that define roles, authority, and closeness. Boundaries can be enmeshed to diffuse, leading to over-involvement and loss of autonomy. Boundaries can also be rigid to distant, leading to isolation and emotional cutoff. Healthy families exist somewhere in between, clear yet flexible. The therapist observes boundary violations during enactments, then helps the family experiment with new ones. For example, in a family where a mother frequently speaks for her teenage son, the therapist might say, "Let's hear from him directly this time. Mom, hold your thoughts for a moment." This simple redirection strengthens the son's autonomy and redefines the parental boundary. In another case, if two parents are disengaged, the therapist might enact a united front, asking them to plan a shared limit for their child. Say it together so he hears one message, not two. This reinforces the parental subsystem as the leadership unit. Over time, these micro adjustments reshape the family's architecture, moving from confusion to clarity. As the hierarchy stabilizes, symptoms like defiance or withdrawal often diminish naturally. Boundary-making tools can include the following: seating arrangements, placing parents together to emphasize unity. There can also be interrupting of cross-generational coalitions. Therapists can also utilize encouraging direct communication between subsystems, and finally, reinforcing successful relational shifts immediately. Therapist stance needed is directive but compassionate, both participant and architect. Here is a core insight. Families don't need perfection. They need structure that supports connection. When roles are clear, love and responsibility can coexist, and healing follows. The final phase of Minuchin's process is reframing, the art of changing how the family sees itself. After structure is stabilized, the therapist helps members reinterpret their behaviors and roles through a compassionate new lens. Reframing is the culmination of the structural family therapy process. It transforms behavioral change into meaningful change. While restructuring creates new interactional patterns, reframing redefines the family's emotional truth. When families first arrive, their stories are often filled with blame and pathology, and they may say things like, "He's lazy," "She's over-controlling," "We can't communicate." Minuchin teaches the therapist to offer new, healing interpretations that honor intention over dysfunction. The goal is to show that beneath every maladaptive behavior lies an attempt at connection or protection. For example, the defiant teenager becomes the truth teller, signaling chaos in the system. The overbearing mother becomes the protector, driven by fear of loss. The distant father becomes the stabilizer, maintaining calm in crisis. By reframing, the therapist helps the family move from judgment to empathy. Each member begins to see others not as problems to fix, but as people doing their best within a strained system. This shift in perception changes the family's emotional climate. Resentment softens into understanding, and previously rigid dynamics begin to loosen naturally. The therapist continues to reinforce these new meanings during enactments and feedback. It sounds like when you raise your voice, you're not trying to control, you're trying to be heard. That simple statement can unlock years of defensiveness and restore compassion. Reframing techniques include the following: highlight intention behind behavior, shift from pathology to protection narrative, use positive labeling, you're strong-willed instead of stubborn. Reinforce reframes through praise and structural validation. Here is a core insight. Reframing completes the healing cycle. The family's story transforms from one of dysfunction to one of resilience and renewal. Though their approaches differ in tone and technique, Bowen and Minuchin complement each other like emotion and form. Bowen helps us see how anxiety and reactivity move through generations, teaching families to respond with awareness and differentiation. Minuchin gives us the tools to reshape what we see, to rebuild boundaries, realign hierarchies, and create order within emotional chaos. Together, these models form the foundation of modern family therapy. Bowen gives families the why, Minuchin gives them the how. When emotion and structure align, families rediscover safety, communication, and the rhythm of belonging. In clinical practice, Bowen's and Minuchin's models blend seamlessly to address both emotional reactivity and organizational dysfunction within families. This integration allows the therapist to observe like Bowen and act like Minuchin, seeing the systemic roots of anxiety while also facilitating tangible behavioral change. Here is how they work together. Bowen helps the therapist map and understand how anxiety flows through generations, while Minuchin provides the tools to reshape and stabilize the system once those patterns are recognized. For example, in a multi-generational household where parents undermine each other and children act out, a Bowenian lens helps the therapist identify triangulation and low differentiation. Then, using Minuchin's structure, the therapist works to restore hierarchy, strengthen the parental subsystem, and create clear roles. Therapist integration strategies include the following: begin Bowenian, observe, map the system, lower anxiety, and promote differentiation. Transition Minuchinian, join, enact, and restructure once trust and awareness are built. Use reframing throughout. Offer new, compassionate interpretations of behaviors to support emotional change. Integration reminds us that insight without action is incomplete, and action without understanding is unsustainable. When emotion and structure evolve together, families don't just change behavior, they transform relationships. Bowen and Minuchin showed us two sides of the same truth. Families are both emotional ecosystems and structured systems. Bowen helps us see the invisible threads of anxiety and emotional inheritance. Minuchin helps us reshape those threads into balanced patterns of connection. Now let's bring everything together, highlighting the essential takeaways, clinical pearls, and exam-ready insights that bridge theory and real-world practice. Bowen's family systems theory and Minuchin's structural family therapy remain foundational to modern family treatment, each addressing a different but complementary layer of family functioning. Together, they teach that healing is both emotional and structural. We must understand the flow of family anxiety and the form of its organization. Here are some Bowenian pearls. See patterns, not people. Focus on how anxiety moves through relationships rather than assigning blame. Promote differentiation. Help clients balance connection and individuality, staying close without emotional fusion. Coach observation, not reaction. Encourage calm self-reflection during family tension to break reactive cycles. Recognize triangles. Detriangulate by restoring direct communication between conflicted members. Here are some Minuchinian pearls. Join before you change. Respect the family's rhythm. Transformation begins with trust. Restructure through action. Use enactments and real-time interventions to shift communication patterns. Clarify hierarchy. Support strong parental leadership and functional boundaries between subsystems. Reframe with compassion. Help families see care within conflict, turning defensiveness into empathy. Integrated wisdom. Bowen gives the family insight into how emotions flow. Minuchin gives them tools to redirect that flow. The goal is not perfection, but balance, a system that flexes without breaking. Lasting change happens when family members can say, "We understand each other differently now." In practice, the skilled clinician learns to think like Bowen and move like Minuchin, observing systemic patterns with neutrality, then guiding structure toward wholeness. In our next video, we'll continue exploring family therapies, Part 2, where classic systems theory meets modern innovation. We'll look at experiential family therapy, which uses emotion and authenticity to deepen connection. Solution-focused therapy, which transforms family narratives through hope and goal-oriented dialogue, and multi-system therapy, designed for complex youth and behavioral cases that extend beyond the home into schools and communities. We'll also examine how these models align with evidence-based, trauma-informed, and recovery-oriented care in today's clinical world. This next module takes us from structure to strategy, from understanding how families are built to empowering how they grow. Thank you for joining me for Family Therapies Part 1, where we explored how families function as both emotional systems and structured organizations. Through Bowen's family systems theory, we learned that anxiety, reactivity, and roles are passed across generations, and that differentiation brings balance without disconnection. Through Minuchin's structural family therapy, we saw how hierarchy, boundaries, and realignment create safety, clarity, and belonging within the family unit. Together, these models reveal that healing a family means both understanding its emotional dance and rebuilding its choreography. One provides insight, the other restores structure. Whether you're thinking about enrolling in an academic program or are beginning your academic program or preparing for boards or even expanding your knowledge for clinical practice, CH Education is here to support your journey with high-yield, clinically grounded, and evidence-based learning. Remember, you can access all course materials, including QBank companions that are supplemented with free notes, memory bullets, and videos like this one on the CH Education app. Each resource is designed to reinforce your knowledge and build your confidence in clinical reasoning every step of your academic or training journey.